London, to speak third and in favour of the motion.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, I will not in any way attempt to refute the words of the honourable opposer of the motion, except simply to say that she has erected a very attractive straw man and perhaps has done him some degree of injury. But let me begin by defining what I at least mean by the doctrine of creation and the theory of evolution. By the doctrine of creation, I mean that view that attributes origins, whether they be cosmological, biological, or anthropological, to the work of a spiritual being, namely God. It further asserts that that work, that creative work of God, is something that lies beyond the power of science to explain. There is nothing in creationism that is inimical to science. I, after all, am a scientist myself. But creationism, or the doctrine of creation, does assert that there are certain things, and in particular these creative acts of God, that by their very nature lie beyond the grasp of science. And therefore much of what I have to say this evening will be directed at delineating the limitations of science. Now, when we turn to the theory of evolution and seek to define that, I would say that it is a theory that seeks to explain origins in terms of natural process alone, without divine intervention. I want to emphasize that aspect of evolution because I want to avoid us doing two things. I want to keep the definition of evolution very general, because I want to avoid, first of all, our getting bogged down with the many detailed arguments that are involved as we consider the different theories of evolution that have been proposed. For evolution is not monolithic. It is not a single theory. The neo-Darwinian theory is, of course, the currently most favored. But there are also the neo-Lamarckians, those who are reviving Lamarck's ideas that the development of life has occurred by the inheritance of acquired characteristics, a thing that Darwinism, of course, denies. And then, of course, we have those who subscribe to punctuated equilibrium. These too are evolutionists, but they are very largely paleontologists, the students of the fossil record, who have come to realize that the fossil record does not tell Darwin's story. They have come to realize that the gaps in the fossil record and the absence of precursor and intermediate forms are such as can no longer be ignored. And they have therefore set aside the idea that the fossil record tells the story of evolution and are proposing that evolution, in fact, occurred off the record relatively rapidly and in localized regions, so that the fossil record does in fact not contain the story of evolution at all. Not only do we have the Darwinians and the Lamarckians and the punctuated equilibrists, but we also have the theistic evolutionists. Now, I want you to particularly note that I'm placing theistic evolution alongside the other evolutionary theories. Theistic evolution, of course, is an attempt to reconcile creation and evolution. The idea is that God did indeed create all things, but that he used the evolutionary process in order to do so. Now, all of these evolutionary viewpoints have one thing in common, including theistic evolution. And that one thing they have in common is the desire to ascribe all things that we see and know and recognize today, the entire cosmos in all its aspects, as the outcome of natural process alone. And it is at this point, I believe, that we must join the debate this evening. Is it possible to explain all things by means of natural process, the normal workings of the laws of science, if you like? Or are there areas of human experience, and are there areas of origins where natural process fails totally to account for the facts as we know them?
Can I point out that the motion of the planets came into the category of those processes which natural events failed to account for before the time of Galileo? After Galileo, they came into the realm of science. After the dark time of Darwin, the origins of man came into the realm of science.
Thank you. I want to emphasize that point at which the debate will, I think, be joined, the distinction between natural process as an all-explanatory theory or purpose, and the creation concept in which there are things that have to be accepted and believed and have occurred as a result of divine fiat and power, and not by natural process. Now, I want to illustrate my point and try to prove it by referring to four things which I believe science can never explain. And let me say at this point that when I say science can never explain these things, I mean exactly that. It is always possible to argue, of course, that next week or next month or in a decade or in 100 years, science will have advanced and progressed to the point where things that are now inexplicable by science will then be explicable. Now, I do not deny that there is a great deal that science has yet to uncover, discover, and explain. I sincerely hope that that is the fact, because I, for one, would be out of a job if it were not. But there are things, I believe, that cannot be explained scientifically, that cannot be ascribed to natural process by their very nature. And I want to mention four of those. First of all, science cannot explain ultimate origins. Now, no doubt many of you are familiar with the theory of the Big Bang, the concept of the origin of our universe in a primordial explosion of unimaginable dimensions. It is not simply the idea that there was an explosion within the universe, within a pre-existing space-time continuum, but rather that the universe itself and space itself and time itself were in those initial moments of the universe confined to an incredibly small dimension. This gigantic explosion has produced the universe as we know it, and it is possible mathematically to trace back the history of the universe to those early moments of its existence. Let us remember, of course, that this is but a theory. It is called by the astrophysicists responsible for it the standard model of the universe, and they emphasize that it is but a model. Now, in that model, you can extrapolate mathematically back to the first 3 minutes of the universe. You can describe the state and condition of the universe when it was no larger than a tennis ball. You can go back even further. You can extrapolate back to the first few seconds, to the first 1,000th of a second. But you can never, by the exercise of scientific theory or the use of mathematics, reach time zero. You are met at that point by a philosophical dilemma. And I can state it in this fashion.
Mr. Honourable Speaker, there is a scientific theory called the new inflationary model, which, although it does not explain in its full glory the total creation, does explain how the universe could have been created at time zero.
Right. There are many theories and many speculations indeed on these matters. I've referred to the Big Bang theory. There is also a theory which we might call the little whimper theory, which refers to the slow and gradual origin of matter by the creation of matter-antimatter pairs. But nevertheless, I would maintain that there is a philosophical dilemma the moment we approach the zero time point. And that is as follows. If the laws of nature that control the universe came into being at the moment the universe came into being, then by definition they could not have been the cause of the universe's origin. If alternatively the laws that control the universe pre-existed the creation of the universe, then they must have existed within some matrix. On what parchment were they written? In what stone were they engraved? Science cannot answer that question. Theology can answer that question. For the doctrine of creation states that before there ever was any space, any time, any matter, any energy, any scientific or natural law, there was God. That God is a self-existent, eternal person, that he is pure spirit, and that it was at his will and at his command that the material universe, with its space and its time and its matter and its energy and its laws, came into being. Science cannot answer questions about the ultimate origin of the universe. Now, the second thing that science cannot do is to explain itself. Now, you ask me what I mean by that. And this is what I mean by that. That science consists very largely in natural law. There is a sense in which one can reduce science, both as a body of information and as a practice, as an activity, to the issue of natural law. Scientists discover natural laws. They try to develop natural laws. They try to understand the connection between natural laws. They try to test natural laws. And if they are in the field of applied science, they try to put natural law to work for the benefit of mankind. Science is all about natural law. If there were no natural law, there would be no science. And yet science must remain forever silent on why natural laws take the form that they do. Let me illustrate this by referring to a law that I'm sure we're all familiar with, the law of gravity. Now, the law of gravity is what is referred to as an inverse square law. That is to say, the force between two massive bodies varies inversely as the square of the distance between them. It is not an inverse cube law, and the force does not vary as 1 divided by the distance to the power 2.1 or 1.9. It is precisely and exactly and eternally an inverse square law. Now, if we ask the question, why should that be? Which is, I believe, a perfectly legitimate question to ask, then science can never give an answer. Science must say, we take nature as it is. Science is descriptive of nature. It is not prescriptive of nature. Science must take the law as it is. And that is what I mean when I say that science can never explain itself. Now, I believe that theology can do what science cannot do. If I walk along a beach covered with millions upon millions of pebbles, and I pick up one pebble from amongst those millions of pebbles, I have made a choice, a selection, and thereby I have left unchosen and unselected a million alternative possibilities. I believe that is exactly what God has done in establishing the laws of nature. The fact that the law of gravity is one particular law out of an infinitude of possible laws, to me, speaks of choice. It speaks of selection. The Bible says that Christ upholds all things by the word of his power. Science would say, of course, that all things are upheld by the laws of nature, and that is a perfectly legitimate statement within a scientific context. The laws of nature, therefore, according to biblical teaching, are the word of God's power. They are there, and they take the form that they do, because God wills them to be there, and he wills them to take that form. Once again, I suggest that where science comes to its legitimate limit, where it comes to an end of its ability to explain, we find that the doctrine of creation can take us further and provide not half an explanation of being, but a full and satisfying one. The third area where I believe science is incapable of providing an explanation is perhaps a more controversial one. But I would suggest that science is incapable ever of explaining the origin of life. Now, there isn't time, certainly not for me, to go into the details of the theory of chemical evolution. Entire books have been written upon the subject for it and against it. But I do want to focus upon one particular aspect, and that is the fact that all life is dependent upon the genetic code. All life is dependent upon a code. That code is written, as many of you know, upon the DNA molecules which reside in every living cell. They make up the genes which control the growth and development and characteristics of any organism. Now, that code is not unlike the Morse code. except that it uses 4 symbols instead of 2. And just like the Morse code, or indeed any alphabet or any code, it is capable of conveying meaningful information. Now, the one point I want to make, and I believe that other honourable speakers later in the debate may take this matter further, the one point I want to make is that life depends upon code and information conveyed by that code. And I would submit that it is impossible for code to arise from chaos, for meaningful information to be generated by random chemical combinations, for significance to arise out of meaninglessness. It is this aspect that makes me believe that the creation, the origin of life, is incapable of explanation and will forever remain incapable of explanation by science. The fourth... Do I have to?
No, you can say no.
The fourth thing that I want to say, the fourth area in which I believe science will forever be incapable of providing an explanation, I beg your pardon, the interruption moved my thoughts away. Let me, before I move on to the fourth point, say simply this, that once again, where science cannot explain the origin of code and information from random or chance events, theology once again can provide the answer. The astronomers, Hoyle and Wick-Grammer-Singer, have put forward theories which are generally rejected by the scientific community. Indeed, I don't accept them myself, but I want to refer to their work because they studied from a purely scientific point of view, they had no religious axe to grind at all, the possibilities, the chances of the spontaneous creation or spontaneous happening, occurrence of life. Those chances are remote. But I simply want to point out that having studied those possibilities, they decided that it was not possible for life to have arisen accidentally or by random chemical process upon Earth during the entire history of the Earth. Well then, they thought they had an answer. They suggested that life might have arisen in space instead, and the advantage of that was, from their point of view, that it gave them a few more thousands of millions of years for it to happen. But having published that view, they later came to a final conclusion that life could not have arisen spontaneously during the entire history of the universe. And they were driven, despite their atheistical position, driven to the conclusion that it was necessary for an intelligent being to have created life because of the information content of living things. Now, I quote them simply to illustrate that scientists who are reasoning only from a scientific point of view have been driven to this conclusion. Let me move on to the fourth point. And my fourth and final point is that science can never explain the phenomenon of mind. The phenomenon of mind. Now, we are all aware, I hope, that there is something rather different about man. I doubt very much whether there is anywhere in the world tonight a debate going on amongst an assembly of dingoes or elephants or porpoises concerning the nature of their origins. There is something different about man. The evolutionist Dawkins referred to the biological uniqueness of man as one of the greatest problems facing evolutionary theory. We have, as a race, the capacity of self-knowledge, the capacity for thought, the capacity for reason. Animals, of course, possess intelligence in many respects, but there is something totally unique about the human mind. Now, the creationist says that is self-evident, because man is made in the image of God. But the evolutionist, unless at this point he deviates from his evolutionism and becomes covertly a special creationist, the evolutionist is unable to account for the origin of mind except as a byproduct, an emanation, almost perhaps a waste product of an organ called the brain. Evolution acts upon, if it acts at all, upon physical organs and physical organisms. And so one can, of course, advance the concept of the evolution of an organ called the brain. But mind, if it is simply the result of such an evolution, whilst perhaps endowing survival value, nevertheless is essentially meaningless and irrational. Mind, as the chance product of the evolution of the brain, despite any survival value it might have, is essentially without meaning and without significance. So perhaps we are all wasting our time here, putting our arguments forward for and against. I don't quite know how to take that applause. There is one very interesting thing, however, about mind, and that is the way in which it interacts with or fits the universe in which we live. The very fact that there is such a thing as science means that we have a... I was given up to 40 minutes.
Yes, the President.
I started at 9:05. Half an hour. Okay. 20 to 40 minutes, I was told, when I was invited, and I'm still well within that time, but I will try to finish properly. The fascinating thing about the mind is that it fits like a hand in a glove with the rational universe in which we live. The very fact that something like science exists means that the universe is rational. It is as accessible to our mind. The fact that the universe can be described in mathematical terms and that our minds are capable of carrying out mathematical reasoning is to me a very significant fact. It is readily explained on the doctrine of creation, for the rational universe was created by a rational God who placed his own rational image in mankind. On evolutionary explanations, I find no way forward. Well then, Madam President, thank you for your indulgence. What I wish to remind you as I close is simply that I have pitched the debate at the point where science wishes, or evolution, wishes to explain everything in terms of natural process. Theology says no, science is limited, and we need to go beyond natural process for a satisfying explanation of what we know and what we are. And I would suggest that at least in the areas of the four illustrations I have given you, that the doctrine of creation